Yes, thank you. So you probably remember that Dina mentioned some of these principles. So I'm going to expand them a little bit so that we can think about them and at the same time think about how we can use them to support the development of tools. So again, remember when I say tools, I'm not talking about tests, but I'm talking about any activity, any kind of instrument that we use to assess, to collect evidence in assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Okay, so we have 8 principles: purpose, construct, validity, reliability, practicality, authenticity, ethics, and washback. So I'm going to go through them more or less quickly. Okay, now let's go to the first one, which is purpose. So Dina mentioned that we have to know why we're assessing. So this is number one. We have to ask ourselves, why am I going to assess? And what am I going to do with the evidences collected? So, for example, in this triangle by Asher, we have the principles for quality education. So why am I going to assess? I could assess for the purpose of accountability, meaning that I have to tell the people in charge, like educational authorities or the parents or the family, what's going on, how well the child developed. So this is accountability. I can also assess because I need to support my students' learning. I need to redirect my teaching. I need to feedback on my process. And I can also assess for any other reasons like certification, progress, from one year to another, from one level to another, and even transfer sometimes. The students have to move school. So we need to tell parents or the authorities, the level that student achieved. So knowing why and what we are doing is very, very important, and what you're going to do with those evidences, right? Okay, now let's move on. Let's go to number 2. Number 2 is construct. This is a word that normally causes some problems because it's not so easy to understand what a construct is. So a construct is an abstract concept. It is a theoretical concept. And the question we should ask is, what is the knowledge, the skill, or the understanding drawn from the curriculum that I intend to assess? So I have to make clear what I am assessing. So I have to go through the definition of the construct. I have to define parameters for the construct to become operational. And I have to define ways to measure the construct. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's suppose our construct is fluency. Fluency is something that, it's very, well, you have lots of definitions in the literature. So we have to agree on one fluency. What is fluency for you? What kind of fluency are you talking about, right? So let's suppose that I define that fluency is related to hesitation. So this is my parameter for the definition of the construct, and so that I can make it operational. So I define fluency as a construct. I define that the parameter I'm going to use to measure that is hesitation. And then how am I going to measure that? For example, this is just a crazy example, but anyway, for example, I'm going to count how many times the student stops or hesitates, right? So this is a silly example. You could think about that for speaking, for reading, for writing, for anything, right? For proficiency. What is proficiency? So all these very broad, abstract, theoretical concepts, they need to be narrowed down, and we need to define parameters and decide how we're going to measure. It doesn't matter what construct that is, right? So there is always a narrowing down process, all right? Okay, fine. Now let's go to number 3. My number 3 principle is validity. Validity is very important, probably one of the most controversial concepts in assessment. There are many, many types of validity. So here I'm talking about two that I consider very important for the design of a tool. So the question I should be asking is my tool measuring what it is supposed to measure, considering what it was designed for and the students I have? So then I have to think about the alignment with the construct that I defined. So this is called construct validity. So for example, if I am checking speaking, I have to ask students to speak, right? So I have to align that with the construct. And also have to consider the alignment with the syllabus, which is called content validity. So of course I have to have my syllabus in mind, my learning objectives in mind. And so if I put them together, and then I could say that my tool is valid for these parameters, for this context I defined. So other than that, it's not going to be valid. Of course, age has to be taken into account. That's why I have to think about my syllabus, I have to think about my construct, so that everything is aligned and I have a valid tool. All right, let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is reliability, and this is very important. So the question I should ask is, can I trust the evidences my tool produces or the information it gives me about my students? So does my tool give me a real idea of what my students know? Is there any contamination? So what I take into account is, for example, my students' familiarity with the tool format. Because if one day I come into class and I apply a tool, apply an assessment instrument that students have never seen before, that's going to contaminate the evidence collection. So how am I going to trust those evidences if they have never seen that tool before? So this is not valid. So I have to consider my students' familiarity with the tool format, right? So usually we use tools or instruments that we have used before in the classroom that students are really familiar with. I have also taken into account the fluctuations in correction. So we all know that, for example, if we have piles of writing essays or essays to correct, when you start, you are okay, you are rested, but at the end you are tired, it's late at night, or you are, after reading lots of different essays, so you have a different picture of what your students produced. So there are fluctuations that interfere. So, for example, if you are influenced by nowadays with the pandemic, we have essays written on the computer, but in the past, when we had handwritten papers, we had to fight against the tendency of being influenced by the students' handwriting, right? When it wasn't clear, when it was, for example, oh, this handwriting is not very nice and it's difficult to read. So this is also included in fluctuations in correction. So every single element that is not in line, is not standardized, helps affect reliability, okay? Another thing is tool administration. So I have to make sure that the way I am administering the tool is reliable, is standardized, is uniform. So when we were in the classroom, any kind of noise, the way, for example, the light in the classroom, everything that could somehow distract students would have to be considered. Nowadays, because we are online, we have other elements. For example, if the student, the child is in his room, is it silent? Does he have or she have a reliable connection, for example? So all these elements related to the administration, then they can have a role in the reliability. And last one is tool design. So for example, if my tool has clear instructions, if I really explained what they have to do, if when we were, for example, in face-to-face teaching, we would worry about the copy, if the copy was clear, if the photocopy was okay, was well taken, right? Anyway, all these elements, they affect reliability. If I don't think about them, I have contamination in the design of my tool. Good. So now let's go to number 5. Number 5 is practicality. So the question I should ask is my tool practical? So first thing is to think about time. So is my tool short enough for the time I have? So isn't it too long? So do I have enough time to use to apply that tool or not? So I have to think about that. I also have to think about how much that would cost. So if there is any cost involved, when we were, for example, in face-to-face teaching, we would have to think about the materials we would need, if you would need a different kind of paper, a different kind of material, a different kind of pen, or anything like that. So nowadays, online, we don't have a cost issue, but we do have, for example, problems related to lack of connection or lack of a good piece of equipment, right? The other one is related to, the other element is related to administration. So if I have a class with 20 students, do I have enough room for them? Do I need help to use my tool? Do I need an assistant? Can I work with all of them at the same time, for example? So we also need to think about that. If I am online, can I monitor all of them at the same time? Is it possible? Or do I need help, right? Okay, and then last but not least, we have correction. So the tool that I designed, how long am I going to take to correct that? For example, some people think that having a multiple choice test or a quiz is much simpler, and actually it is simple, but simple to correct, but it's not so easy to design, because a very good multiple choice test or quiz to be very well designed takes time, right? Also, how much work will I have to devote to correct, for example, if I have open questions, right? If I have 30 students and I use open questions, how long will that take me to correct and give feedback? So these are practical issues that I have to think about when I design a tool. Right, now let's go to number 6. Number 6 is authenticity, and the question I should ask is my tool as close to my students' real life as possible? And here we have several elements to be taken into account. I have to start thinking about the concept of language that I have. So for example, if I think that language is a set of structures, then of course it's a bit difficult to design tools that are close to students' real life. So to be able to do that, my concept of language should be more related to language as social practice or language as action. So people do things with the language. So knowing what to do with the language and not knowing about the language, right? So that would help me design tools that are closer to students' real life. And then that leads me obviously to focus on performance. So asking students to perform, to do tasks that sometimes somehow mirror what they do in real life. And this is very nice to do with kids and with teenagers, for example, right? Involving them in, for example, writing rules for games, for example, that they could share, they could talk to students, to their peers. So focus on performance, not on explaining the teacher what they know about the language again. And that leads me to the next one, which is plausible situations. Again, things that, resemble what students could have in their real lives, that could happen to them, not something completely strange to their realities, right? And of course, contextualized tasks. So students have to be put into context. They should understand why that's happening, why that situation is being, put in front of them. That leads us also to something that Dina mentioned, which is age-suitable themes and situations. So everything we do should take into account our students' age, our students' interests, if that's possible. So when we talk about children, as Dina showed, we have 3 different groups or 4 different groups of children, right, depending on the age. So they vary a lot. So we do need to know our students very well to choose the best themes and situations for them to perform with. And then last but not least, it's skills integration. In real life, we very unusually use one skill at a time. So we normally do things together. So we listen and write, or we read and write, or we speak and listen. So putting skills together, having performances with skills integration is also part of being authentic in the design of our tools. Okay, that's quite a lot about authenticity. Let's go to number 7. Good. So ethics is something that has been very, very, very important in the last years, especially because the assessment community is aware of how much assessment affects people's lives. So the consequences, the social consequences of assessment and testing are huge. So ethical issues have to be taken into account. So the question I should ask here is, does my tool comply with ethical principles? And then I raised here 4 issues: transparency, respect for privacy, fairness, and no prejudice or bias. So when we talk about transparency, what I mean is to, for example, to think about things like, do my students know what they're being assessed for? Do my students know the criteria? Have I shared the criteria with them? So am I being transparent? We all know that, for example, when we are going to take a test or we are going to go through the process, we want to know what's going to happen. We want to know what will be demanded from us. So it's the same with our students. So being transparent, sharing, okay, look, this tool, this activity, we're going to focus on this, on that. So this is part of transparency. Respect for privacy. There are 2 things that I would highlight in terms of transparency, in terms of respect for privacy. So first one is exposure. So exposing students' weak points is not good, right? And on the other hand, extremely exposing students' strong points is also bad. So we have to balance that and respect their privacy in terms of exposure, in terms of their relationship with the other friends, with the other colleagues. The second thing is privacy in relation to their grades. So it's as much as possible, we should try to respect, because sometimes comparing grades and showing other people their grades and talking to people about students that had high grades or low grades is not very ethical. So we should be careful with that, especially when we talk about children. The other element is fairness, and fairness is related to providing equal treatment as much as possible. Of course, respecting people's differences, but we have to consider their needs and try to do our best to provide them with fair treatment, everybody having opportunities that are the same. And the last one is no prejudice or bias. And here we have to remember that by the simple choice of, for example, specific texts or specific topics or specific images, we might be bringing some prejudice or some biased issues into the classroom. So sexism, racism, ethnical prejudice, this should also be avoided, of course, as much as possible. So we do need to be careful with images, texts, judgments, preferences that we have sometimes in the classroom, so that we have an ethical attitude in the tool we design. Okay, and number 8, my last principle is washback. And the question I should ask is, what are the potential positive and negative washback effects that my tool could cause? So I have to remember, and Dina also mentioned that, positive washback. So I have to remember that washback could be positive and negative. So I wrote here examples. They're not the only ones, of course, but there are many. But I put 2 examples for positive, 2 examples for negative. So, for example, a positive washback effect would be change in study habits, for example, in my students' study habits. Depending on the way I conduct assessment in the classroom, they might be encouraged to study in a different way. And if that's positive to them, then the washback is good. Also, by working well with assessment, by designing well my tools, I can also provide them with more autonomy, give them more chance to become autonomous. On the other hand, negative washback also happens. For example, when I give too much emphasis on a particular skill, I only work, for example, with writing most of the time in my classes, or I only work with reading most of the time in my classes. And also too much emphasis on language structure, for example, because then I give my students the message, I convey my students the message that structures are more important than performance. And we have to remember that we learn languages to communicate, we learn languages to do things in the world, to act in the world, and not just to use meta language about the language, right? Okay. Now going to the last part of my talk. Can we go to the next slide then? Right. So here I put lots of tools just to keep my metaphor. So use the right tool for the right job. So I think that these principles, they should be kept in mind for improved tool design. So the more careful we are with that, with this design, the better for us, the better for our students. So we can design different tools. So we just have to make sure we use the right one for the right moment, for the right assessment, for the right job. That's it. Thank you very much.